You are a barren investment, her ex-husband sneered, flaunting his pregnant mistress right in her face in the middle of the courtroom. Look at you. No heir, no legacy, useless. Vanessa just stood there, swallowing the shame as he celebrated his victory. Until the doors burst open. Two teenage boys who looked exactly like him walked through the crowd, clung to Vanessa's side, and slammed a paper on the table. "She's not useless," one boy said. "She's our mother." And the way Christopher froze, the way the color drained from his face when he saw his own eyes staring back at him, told everyone this empire was about to crumble. Please sit back, relax, as we dive fully into this really remarkable story of corporate revenge. Viewers, before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor. If you love stories about justice, billion-dollar secrets, and DNA reveals that destroy egos, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you don't want to miss how this ends. Drop a like on this video. It actually helps more than you think. And comment below telling me where you're watching from. Are you in New York, Ottawa, London? I want to know. Now let's get into this story because the truth is about to come out. The air in the courtroom wasn't just cold, it was sterilized, stripped of any warmth or humanity, much like the marriage being dissected before the judge. Christopher sat at the mahogany table, checking his watch, a platinum Patek Philippe that cost more than the house Vanessa grew up in. To him, this wasn't a tragedy, it was a transaction, a liquidation of a non-performing asset. Vanessa sat alone on her side. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned the color of old bone. She kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood, refusing to look at them, but she could feel them. She could feel the heat radiating from Cynthia, who sat just behind Christopher, a strategic placement meant to twist the knife. Cynthia, with her hand resting protectively, performatively over the swell of her belly. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, peering over his spectacles, "we are here to finalize the dissolution of assets. Your counsel has argued for a complete severance with minimal alimony based on the prenuptial agreement's failure to produce issue clause. Is this your stance?" Christopher stood up. He didn't just stand, he unfolded himself with the grace of a predator who knows the jungle belongs to him. He adjusted his cufflinks, cast a pitying glance at Vanessa, and then addressed the court with a voice smooth as aged scotch. "Your Honor," Christopher began, "in the worlds of business, we cut losses. We analyze ROI, return on investment. When I married Vanessa, it was a partnership with clear expectations, continuity, legacy, a line of succession for the Sterling Empire." He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing everyone to look at Vanessa. "I provided the lifestyle, the status, the stability," Christopher continued, his tone hardening, "and in return, I asked for one thing, an heir. 5 years, Your Honor, 5 years of doctors, specialists, and silence in the nursery." He turned fully toward Vanessa now. "She is a barren investment, Your Honor, useless to my lineage, useless to the future of my company. Why should I continue to fund a venture that has yielded 0 returns?" The word hung in the air, useless. It wasn't shouted, it was stated like a fact, a line item on a balance sheet. Vanessa felt the breath leave her lungs. She wanted to scream that she had taken the shots, the hormones, the invasive procedures. She wanted to scream about the nights she held him while he wept over his father's pressure, or the way she had managed his home and his image. But in this room, none of that mattered. In the eyes of the law and Christopher Sterling, she was simply a vessel that had failed to launch. Cynthia let out a soft, audible sigh, shifting so the light caught the diamond on her finger, Vanessa's replacement. She whispered something to Christopher, and he smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile that Vanessa hadn't seen directed at her in years. "Order," the judge said, though the damage was already done. He looked at Vanessa with a flicker of sympathy that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The law was the law, and the prenuptial agreement was ironclad. "The court grants the divorce on the stated terms. The marriage is dissolved." The bang of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Final. Fatal. Christopher didn't waste a second. He turned to Cynthia, helping her stand with an exaggerated tenderness that made Vanessa's stomach turn. "Come, darling," he said, loud enough for the press at the back of the room to hear. "Let's go celebrate the future. A real future." Cynthia beamed, linking her arm through his. As they passed Vanessa, Cynthia slowed down just enough to lean in, her voice dripping with poison. "Don't worry, sweetie," she purred. "I'll take good care of what you couldn't handle." Vanessa didn't move until they were gone. She sat there while the clerks shuffled papers, while the bailiff checked his phone. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of identity. She was no longer Mrs. Sterling, she was just Vanessa. And according to the man she had loved for half a decade, she was useless. Walking out of the courthouse felt like walking into a different world. The heavy oak doors swung open and the flashbulbs erupted. But they weren't for her. The photographers were swarming the black limousine waiting at the curb. Christopher was already inside, pouring champagne into a crystal flute. Cynthia was waving, framing her baby bump for the cameras. "Mr. Sterling, is it a boy? Mr. Sterling, how does it feel to finally have an heir on the way?" Vanessa watched from the top of the concrete steps. She saw Christopher laugh, head thrown back, victorious. He raised his glass in a toast to the cameras, to the city, to himself. The tinted window rolled up, sealing them in their bubble of wealth and fertility. The car pulled away, parting the sea of reporters, leaving only exhaust fumes in its wake. Then the sky opened up. It started as a drizzle, cold and biting, but quickly turned into a deluge. The reporters scattered, running for cover, their interest in the discarded wife non-existent now that the main attraction had left. Vanessa stood frozen. The rain soaked through her beige suit, the one she had bought to look sensible and dignified. It plastered her hair to her forehead and ran down her cheeks, masking the tears she had refused to shed inside. Useless. The word echoed in her mind, louder than the thunder rolling over the skyscrapers. She looked down at her empty hands. No ring, no money, no child. She took a step down, her heel slipping slightly on the wet stone. She caught herself on the railing, the cold metal biting into her palm. She took a breath. It was shaky and wet, but it was a breath. "Not useless," she whispered to the rain, though she didn't quite believe it yet. Just empty. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and walked down the steps, into the gray, washing away the life she used to know, step by painful step. 3 years is a lifetime in the city. It is enough time for skylines to change, for fortunes to be made, and for a woman who was once left standing in the rain to learn how to become the storm. On the glossy cover of Business Weekly, Christopher Sterling looked like a titan. The headlines screamed the Midas touch, how Sterling solidified his legacy. In the photo, he was leaning against a mahogany desk, a glass of amber whiskey in one hand, smiling that winning, predatory smile that convinced shareholders their money was safer with him than in a vault. Beside him in the spread, inset in a smaller, softer frame, was Cynthia, looking impeccably airbrushed, holding their 2-year-old son, Julian. The caption read, "The heir apparent." To the outside world, Christopher had won. He had the empire, the trophy wife, and the biological proof of his virility that he had so desperately craved. But paper is thin, and ink can lie. Inside the Sterling penthouse, the air was always set to a chill 68 degrees. It was a museum of a home, filled with sculptures that cost more than most people earned in a decade, yet devoid of any actual life. Christopher stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis he helped build, nursing a drink that he'd started pouring earlier and earlier in the day. "Chris, are you listening to me?" Cynthia's voice grated against the silence. She was lounging on a custom Italian sofa, scrolling through her phone with manicured precision. "The decorator needs to know if we're doing the nursery in celestial blue or royal navy. I told him royal, obviously. Julian is a little prince, after all." Christopher didn't turn around. "Do whatever you want, Cynthia. Send the bill to accounting." "You're always so distant lately," she huffed, standing up and smoothing her silk dress. "You should be happy. We have everything you wanted. Julian is perfect." Christopher took a sip of the scotch. Was he? He looked over at the playpen in the corner where the toddler sat surrounded by imported educational toys. The boy was undeniably handsome, with Cynthia's fair hair and a petulant set to his mouth that mirrored his mother's. But whenever Christopher looked at him, he felt nothing. There was no spark of recognition, no primal pull of blood calling to blood. He told himself it was just stress, or perhaps that fatherhood was more abstract for men of his stature. He provided the kingdom, the boy just had to exist to inherit it. "I'm going to the club," Christopher said abruptly, setting his glass down. "Again?" Cynthia snapped. "You promised to be here for the Vogue interview prep." "I'm busy, Cynthia, being the reason we can afford the decorator." He walked out before she could argue, the heavy door clicking shut, sealing the coldness inside. He had the legacy he demanded, but it felt like wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. Expensive, impressive to onlookers, but uncomfortable in the joints. 30 blocks away in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Archer & Co., Sterling's fiercest competitor, the atmosphere was electric, but for a different reason. "The projections are conservative," a man in a gray suit said, tapping a laser pointer at a screen. "We should wait until Q3 to launch the acquisition." "If we wait until Q3, the market will have shifted and we'll be buying a carcass," a woman's voice cut through the room. It was low, steady, and possessed an authority that made the man with the laser pointer sit down. Vanessa didn't look like the woman who had wept on the courthouse steps 3 years ago. The beige, sensible suits were gone, replaced by sharp, tailored charcoal and navy cuts that accentuated a new hardness in her posture. Her hair was cut into a sleek, asymmetrical bob that required zero maintenance and commanded absolute attention. She stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the faces of the board members. She had clawed her way into this room. When Christopher had discarded her, he had underestimated one thing. Vanessa had been the silent engine behind Christopher's own domestic stability for years. She knew how to manage egos, how to organize chaos, and how to endure pain. When she channeled that energy into corporate strategy, she became unstoppable. "We buy now," Vanessa stated, her voice leaving no room for debate. "I leverage the volatility in the tech sector. I've already run the risk assessment. It's aggressive, yes, but I don't get paid to be safe. I get paid to be right." The CEO of Archer & Co., a silver-haired woman named Eleanor who had taken a chance on the scandalous divorcee, smiled from the corner. "You heard her," Eleanor said. "Proceed with Vanessa's strategy." As the meeting dispersed, colleagues nodded at Vanessa with a mix of admiration and fear. They called her the Iron Lady in the break room. They whispered that she had no personal life, that she was married to the firm. They weren't wrong. Vanessa walked back to her office, closing the door and exhaling a breath she felt she'd been holding since the morning. She walked to her window. Her view wasn't as high as Christopher's penthouse, but it was hers. Every inch of this office, every dollar in her bank account, she had earned. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Her background image wasn't a family photo or a vacation spot. It was a simple, abstract painting of a storm at sea. Her phone buzzed. It was her mom, calling for the weekly check-in. She let it ring twice before answering, forcing warmth into her tone. "Hi, Mom." "Vanessa, honey, I saw Business Weekly at the dentist's office," her mother said, her voice tentative. "He's on the cover again." Vanessa's hand tightened on her pen until the plastic creaked. "I know, Mom. It's a small world." "He looks happy," her mother added, regretfully. "And the baby—" "Mom," Vanessa cut her off, gentle but firm. "I have a meeting in 5 minutes. Is everything okay with Dad?" She steered the conversation away, methodically, efficiently. She didn't talk about Christopher. She didn't talk about the baby. That part of her life was a closed room, boarded up and condemned. The word useless still echoed in her head sometimes, usually late at night when the adrenaline of the workday faded and the silence of her apartment crept in. To drown it out, she worked. She worked until her eyes blurred and her exhaustion was heavy enough to knock her unconscious without dreams. She had climbed the corporate ladder not as ambition, but as necessity. Success was the only armor that fit her now. She packed her bag, luxury leather bought with her own bonus check, and headed for the elevator.
As she descended to the lobby, she caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked successful. She looked powerful. She looked complete. But as she stepped out into the cool evening air, the same rain that had baptized her 3 years ago began to fall again. Vanessa didn't run for cover this time. She opened her umbrella, a stark black shield against the elements, and walked into the night. She had rebuilt the walls, fortified the castle, and conquered the kingdom of her career. But as she hailed a cab to go home to an empty apartment, she knew the truth that magazines couldn't capture. You can build a fortress to keep the world out, but sometimes you just end up trapping the cold inside.
The annual Minds of Tomorrow STEM showcase was the antithesis of the Archer & Co. boardroom. It was loud, chaotic, and smelled faintly of vinegar volcanoes and soldering iron smoke. Yet for Vanessa, it had become a sanctuary. 7 years had passed since the divorce, 4 since she had taken that VP position, and while her bank account had swelled, her social calendar remained intentionally barren. She filled the evenings with work and the weekends with volunteering, judging science fairs where ambition was still pure and uncorrupted by stock options. She adjusted her lanyard, the plastic judge tag catching the light, and moved down the aisle of the convention center. She had already sat through 3 presentations on photosynthesis and 1 very enthusiastic pitch for a robot that could butter toast, though it mostly just launched bread across the table. She was smiling, a genuine soft expression that rarely made an appearance in her office. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency in Urban Traffic Flow were 2 boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency in Urban Traffic Flow were 2 boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency in Urban Traffic Flow were 2 boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency and Urban Traffic Flow were two boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency and Urban Traffic Flow were two boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency and Urban Traffic Flow were two boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency and Urban Traffic Flow were two boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402.
She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency in Urban Traffic Flow were two boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline, the same nose with the slight aristocratic bridge, and the eyes, a piercing, icy cerulean blue that she hadn't seen in 7 years. They were Christopher's eyes. Vanessa gripped her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. For a terrifying second, she thought she was hallucinating, that the stress of the upcoming merger was finally causing her mind to fracture and project her ex-husband's ghost onto strangers. "Ma'am?" The voice was polite, steady, and dropped an octave lower than the squeaky enthusiasm of the previous presenters. Vanessa turned toward booth 402. She stopped. The air in her lungs seemed to solidify. Standing behind a display titled Algorithmic Efficiency in Urban Traffic Flow were two boys. They were identical twins, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in matching navy blazers that were slightly too large at the shoulders, as if bought with the expectation of a growth spurt. But it wasn't the project or the attire that made Vanessa's heart hammer against her ribs. It was their faces. They had the same square, determined jawline. The scheduled meeting with the patent attorneys was supposed to be a triumph. A bridge Vanessa Cross was building between the cold corporate world and two brilliant, forgotten boys. She had arranged it in the executive conference room at Archer & Co., wanting James and Lucas to feel the weight of their own potential. When they walked in, wearing the same ill-fitting blazers from the science fair, they looked small against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline, but their eyes were bright with anticipation. "So, the intellectual property rights would remain yours," the attorney was explaining, sliding a thick document across the glass table. "Archer & Co. would simply act as the incubator." "That means you can't steal it," Lucas whispered to James, nudging his brother's arm with a grin. James didn't grin back. He was staring at the water pitcher in the center of the table, his brow furrowed in a way that was intimately, painfully familiar to Vanessa. It was the same expression Christopher used to wear when a migraine was coming on, a tightening of the eyes, a slight pinch of the lips. "Vanessa?" She leaned forward, her executive mask slipping. "Do you have a question?" James blinked slowly, as if the air around him had turned to syrup. He tried to stand, bracing his hand against the edge of the table. "I feel wrong." The color drained from his face in a single terrifying second, leaving him a translucent gray. His knees unlocked and he crumpled. "James!" Lucas screamed, a raw, jagged sound that shattered the room's sterile composure. Vanessa moved before the attorney had even dropped his pen. She vaulted from her chair, her instincts overriding her logic, and slid onto the floor just as James hit the carpet. She caught his head in her lap, her hands instantly seeking a pulse. His skin was burning, radiating a dry, feverish heat that felt dangerous. "Call 911, Vanessa barked at the attorney, her voice slicing through his shock. "Now, and get security to clear the elevator." She looked down at the boy in her arms. James's eyes were rolling back, his limbs beginning to twitch in the onset of a seizure. "Lucas, talk to him," she ordered, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "James, don't do this." Lucas was on his knees beside her, gripping his brother's hand with white-knuckled terror. "Miss Cross, what's happening? He was fine this morning. He was fine." "It's okay, we've got him," Vanessa lied, brushing the damp hair off James's forehead. Her fingers traced the line of his temple, and a jolt of déjà vu nearly stopped her heart. The bone structure, the way his hairline peaked. She had traced these exact lines 1,000 times in the dark, lying next to a man who had eventually thrown her away. But holding James didn't feel like holding a memory of Christopher. It felt urgent. It felt present. It felt mine. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and static. Vanessa refused to be separated from them. When the paramedics tried to guide her to the waiting area of St. Luke's emergency room, she flashed her badge and used her boardroom voice, the one that made grown men sit down and shut up. She stayed. The trauma bay was chaos. Doctors swarmed the gurney, cutting open James's cheap blazer, shouting out vitals. Vanessa stood in the corner, holding a terrifyingly silent Lucas against her side. Her arm was wrapped around his shoulders, her hand gripping him tight, acting as a physical shield against the world. BP is dropping. Temp is 104, a nurse shouted. A doctor with harried eyes turned to them, clipboard in hand. Who is the parent? They don't have parents, Vanessa said, the words tasting like ash. They're wards of the state. I'm a friend. The doctor looked frustrated. We need medical history, now. Does he have a history of seizures, cardiac arrhythmia, genetic defects? Vanessa looked down at Lucas. The boy looked up at her, his blue eyes swimming with tears and total helplessness. I don't know, Lucas whispered, his voice cracking. Our file just says parents unknown. We don't know anything. We're flying blind, the doctor cursed, turning back to the bed. Run a full panel. Tox, metabolic, genetic. Get a CT scan. Let's go. As they wheeled James away, Vanessa felt a physical sensation in the center of her chest, a phantom pull, like an invisible tether snapping taut. It wasn't just concern for a student, it was a biological imperative, a desperate, clawing need to run after that gurney and know. She looked at Lucas. He was shivering, despite the warmth of the hospital. Vanessa took off her blazer, her armor, and wrapped it around his shoulders. Is he going to die? Lucas asked, looking at the swinging doors where his brother had vanished. No, Vanessa said, and the ferocity in her voice surprised even her. I won't let that happen. But we don't have money, Lucas mumbled, pulling the expensive fabric tighter. The group home doctor said, I don't care what they said, Vanessa interrupted. She knelt down so she was eye level with him. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable, but she saw something else too. Something that had been nagging at her since the science fair. Lucas had Christopher's jaw, yes, but he had her brow. He had the same slightly crooked pinky finger she did. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The doctor had asked for family history. Vanessa felt a sudden terrifying certainty that the history wasn't in a missing file. It was standing in the room. She stood up, her mind racing, connecting dots she had been too afraid to see. The timing, the surrogate Christopher had dismissed, the closed adoption, the age of the boys. She walked to the nurse's station, her steps echoing on the linoleum. She felt a cold, diamond-hard resolve settling in her gut. I need to authorize a transfer to a private suite for James Doe, pulling out her platinum card. I'm covering all costs. Relation? The nurse asked mechanically, typing into the computer. Vanessa looked back at Lucas, who was watching her with an expression of pure trust. She looked at the doors where her brother was fighting for his life. The phantom pull tugged again, harder this time, demanding action. I'm his advocate, Vanessa said, though the word she wanted to say was stuck in her throat. And I want a DNA test run alongside his blood work immediately. The nurse paused and looked up. A DNA test? That's not standard for a seizure. It is for a genetic history inquiry, Vanessa lied smoothly, channeling every ounce of her corporate authority. If we don't know where he comes from, we don't know how to treat him. Just run it. I'll pay for the rush. As the nurse nodded and took the card, Vanessa leaned against the counter, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent years believing she was useless, a dead end. Now, staring down the corridor of the ER, she had a terrifying, wonderful feeling that she was about to be proven wrong.
The private suite at St. Luke's was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic cacophony of the trauma bay. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the soft, ragged breathing of James, who lay unconscious in the center of the room. He looked devastatingly small against the crisp white sheets, his skin pale and translucent, stripped of the bravado he had worn at the science fair. Vanessa stood by the window, her arms crossed tight across her chest, watching the city lights blur through the glass. She hadn't left the room for 3 hours. Lucas was curled up in the uncomfortable vinyl armchair in the corner, asleep from sheer exhaustion, his head resting on his knees. The door clicked open and the attending physician, Dr. Harris, stepped in. He looked tired, rubbing the bridge of his nose before checking the monitors. Vanessa turned immediately, her posture straightening into the defensive stance she used in board meetings. "Talk to me," she demanded, her voice low so as not to wake Lucas. "He's stable," Dr. Harris said, keeping his voice hushed. The seizure was triggered by a severe electrolyte imbalance caused by a metabolic spike. "We've stabilized his fluids and his fever is down, but the blood work, it's interesting." Vanessa moved closer to the bed. "Interesting how?" "We ran the standard panel, but because of the severity of the fever, we looked for genetic anomalies," Dr. Harris explained, flipping through the chart. "We found a rare marker. It's a variation of the MYH7 gene, usually linked to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but in this specific variant, it presents with these acute metabolic fevers in adolescence." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The air left Vanessa's lungs in a rush, replaced by a cold, sharp memory. 7 years ago, a fertility clinic on the Upper East Side, the sterile smell of alcohol wipes and failure. She remembered sitting in the plush leather chair while Christopher paced the room, furious that another cycle had failed. The specialist, a terrified little man in a lab coat, had tried to explain that while Vanessa's counts were low, there was also a complexity with Christopher's sample. "A genetic marker," the doctor had said, "the MYH7 variant. It's rare, Mr. Sterling. It can make viability difficult." Christopher had exploded. "My genetics are perfect," he had roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "My grandfather lived to be 90. My father runs marathons. Don't you dare blame my blood for her failure." He had forced the doctor to strike it from the record, to focus entirely on Vanessa's hostile uterus. He refused to believe his DNA was anything less than divine. Vanessa stared at Dr. Harris, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The MYH7 variant," she repeated, her voice trembling. Is it hereditary?" "Almost exclusively paternal," Dr. Harris nodded. "It's a dominant trait. If a father has it, there's a 50-50 chance the son inherits it. That's why we need the family history, Miss Cross. If the father has heart issues, we need to know to treat James effectively." Vanessa looked at James's sleeping face, the slope of his nose, the shape of his ears, and now the blood running through his veins, carrying the same rare, arrogant code as Christopher Sterling. I'll see what I can find out," Vanessa whispered. "I need to make a call." She stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind her. She felt lightheaded, the pieces of the puzzle slamming together with violent force. The resemblance wasn't a coincidence, the intellect wasn't a fluke, and the medical condition wasn't random. But she couldn't go to Christopher, not yet. If she walked into his office with a hunch, he would destroy her. He would bury her in lawsuits, claim she was a stalker, a crazy ex-wife obsessed with the past. She needed irrefutable proof. She needed something that would hold up not just in a hospital, but in a court of law. She needed DNA. She looked back through the glass window of the suite. Lucas was stirring. He rubbed his eyes, stretched, and reached for the plastic water cup on the bedside table. He took a long, thirsty gulp, draining the water, and then crushed the cup in his hand. Vanessa's eyes locked onto that cup. She took a deep breath, smoothing her skirt, and walked back into the room. Lucas looked up, his blue eyes wide and fearful. "Is he okay?" Lucas asked, his voice rough from sleep. "He's going to be fine," Vanessa said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "The doctor said his fever is down. He just needs rest." She walked over to the bedside table. "You look dehydrated, Lucas. Do you want more water?" "No, I'm okay," Lucas said, tossing the crushed cup into the small wastebasket beside the chair. "Okay, why don't you go wash your face? You've been crying. It will help you wake up," she suggested gently. Lucas nodded, standing on shaky legs. "Yeah, okay." He shuffled toward the ensuite bathroom. The moment the bathroom door closed, Vanessa moved with the speed and precision of a thief. She reached into the wastebasket and retrieved the crushed plastic cup. She held it by the rim, careful not to touch the area where Lucas's lips had been. It was a filmy piece of trash, but to her, it weighed 1,000 pounds. It held the truth. She grabbed a biohazard bag from the wall dispenser, meant for nurses, and dropped the cup inside, sealing it tight. She shoved the bag deep into her luxury handbag, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint.
She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years, a private investigator Archer & C used for high-stakes corporate vetting. "It's Vanessa Cross," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she stepped back into the hallway. "I need a rush job. Paternity verification. I have a sample from the child. I need you to pull the comparison sample from existing medical records." "Whose records, Miss Cross?" the other end of the phone asked. Vanessa looked at the closed door of the hospital suite, then at the reflection of herself in the glass. She looked like a woman on the edge of a cliff, deciding to step back or dive. "Christopher Sterling," she said, the name tasting like copper in her mouth. "He has a file at the Weill Cornell fertility clinic from 7 years ago. Get the data, run the match. I want the results by tomorrow morning." "That's illegal without a court order, Miss Cross." "I don't care about the legality," Vanessa hissed with her eyes flashing. "I care about the truth. I'll pay double. Just get it done." She hung up before he could argue. She pressed the phone to her chest, breathing hard. She had the thread now. She had pulled it, and the entire tapestry of Christopher's lie was beginning to unravel. She wasn't the barren ex-wife anymore. She was the woman holding the smoking gun, and for the first time in 7 years, Christopher Sterling was in the crosshairs.
The wait for the DNA results was a physical weight, a heavy stone sitting in the pit of Vanessa's stomach that made sleep impossible. Her apartment, usually her sanctuary of minimalist calm, felt claustrophobic. The silence was too loud, filled with the phantom echoes of James's shallow breathing and Lucas's terrified questions. She couldn't just sit and wait for the phone to ring. She had to do something. She had to know how. If James and Lucas were Christopher's sons, and every instinct in her body screamed that they were, then they hadn't materialized out of thin air. There had to be a mechanism, a transaction, a paper trail. Christopher Sterling didn't do anything without a contract. Vanessa moved to the walk-in closet in her master bedroom. On the highest shelf, tucked behind rows of designer handbags she rarely used, sat a gray, fireproof box. It contained the detritus of her marriage, not the sentimental things, which she had burned in a cathartic bonfire 3 years ago, but the logistical ones: tax returns, joint asset filings, property deeds. She had kept them not out of nostalgia, but out of a paralegal's instinct that one day the IRS or a lawyer might come knocking. She pulled the box down, the dust coating her fingers, and carried it to the living room coffee table. She poured herself a glass of wine she knew she wouldn't drink and cracked the lid. The smell of old paper and stale memories wafted out. She began to sift, her movements methodical, trained by years of due diligence. She bypassed the mortgage papers for the penthouse, the receipts for the jewelry he'd bought her as apologies for missed anniversaries. She was looking for anomalies, gaps in the timeline, money that moved without explanation. She focused on the bank statements from the year before the divorce, the year the IVF treatments had reached their frantic, desperate peak. She remembered that year as a blur of hormones and tears, but looking at the numbers now, she saw a different story. There, a wire transfer for $50,000, October 14th. The recipient was listed simply as Genesis Consulting. Vanessa frowned. She remembered October. That was the month Dr. Evans had told her that her egg quality was too degraded to continue. Christopher was furious, disappearing for days on business trips to Zurich. Had he been consulting another clinic? She dug deeper, finding the corresponding credit card statements, a flight to Chicago, a hotel near a medical district, and then a series of monthly payments to a residential address in Illinois that stopped abruptly 3 months later. Vanessa grabbed her laptop and typed Genesis Consulting Chicago into the search bar. The results were sparse: a dissolved LLC, a defunct website archived on the Wayback Machine. Genesis, elite surrogacy for discerning families. Her breath hitched. She went back to the box, flipping through the files with frantic urgency. If he had hired a surrogate, there would be legal paperwork. Christopher never entered a deal without an escape clause. She found it at the bottom of the stack, misfiled inside a folder labeled Charitable Donations. It was a blue folder, thinner than the rest. Inside was a contract, the edges crisp, the signatures inked in Christopher's aggressive, jagged scrawl. surrogacy agreement between Christopher Sterling, intended parent, and Maya Lynn, gestational carrier. Vanessa stared at the name. Maya Lynn. She didn't know her. She had never heard her name. While Vanessa was injecting herself with hormones, weeping over negative pregnancy tests, Christopher had secretly hired a woman to carry the heir he so desperately wanted, hedging his bets like he was shorting a stock. She turned the page, her hand trembling. The date of the contract was 2 weeks before he filed for divorce. He had been planning to leave her the moment the surrogate was confirmed pregnant. He wanted the baby, just not the wife. But why didn't they have them? Why were James and Lucas living in a group home with ill-fitting blazers and no history? Vanessa found the answer clipped to the back of the contract. It was a letter from Christopher's personal attorney dated 3 months into the pregnancy. Subject: termination of agreement, settlement offer. Dear Miss Lynn, per our client's instruction, we are invoking the termination clause regarding the Project Gemini assets. Following your report of significant bleeding and the attending physician's concerns regarding potential miscarriage, Mr. Sterling has deemed the viability of the pregnancy to be insufficient to warrant further investment. He wishes to avoid the sunk cost of a high-risk medical event. Enclosed is a check for $25,000. This payment is contingent on your signature on the attached non-disclosure agreement. You agreed to dissolve the contract, assume full medical responsibility for the termination of the pregnancy or any resulting medical care, and never contact Mr. Sterling again. His involvement ends here. Vanessa read the letter twice, bile rising in her throat. Sunk cost, she whispered, the cruelty of the phrase cutting her deeper than any knife. The surrogate, Maya, had experienced a scare, likely just spotting, common in twin pregnancies, and Christopher hadn't waited for a second opinion. He hadn't flown to her side to hold her hand or pray for the babies. He looked at the odds, decided they were bad for business, and liquidated the asset. He paid her to go away and terminate the problem. But Maya hadn't terminated. Vanessa looked at the date on the settlement check copy. It was 7 months before the boys were born. Maya Lynn had taken the hush money, likely terrified of the powerful man who treated her unborn children like a failed merger, and she had disappeared. She had saved the pregnancy, carried the twins to term in secret, and then what? Died? Given them up because she couldn't afford 2 babies on a hush money budget? The realization crashed over Vanessa with the force of a physical blow. Christopher hadn't just abandoned his children, he had paid for their erasure. He believed they were medical waste. He believed they didn't exist. And because of his arrogance, because of his obsession with perfection and efficiency, he had thrown away the only true legacy he had. Vanessa closed the file, her hands shaking not with fear, but with a cold, terrifying rage. She looked at the clock. It was 4 a.m. The sun would be up soon. The DNA results would be in her inbox within hours. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain streak the glass. She thought of James in that hospital bed fighting a fever caused by his father's blood. She thought of Lucas sleeping in the chair protecting his brother. They were survivors. They had survived Christopher's rejection before they had taken their first breath. Vanessa placed her hand on the cold glass. He called you a bad investment, she said to the city, her voice steely. She turned back to the room, grabbing the blue folder. She didn't need to put it back in the safe. She needed to put it in her briefcase. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was ammunition. Christopher Sterling wanted a war. He was about to find out that the useless wife he discarded had spent the last 3 years learning how to shoot.
James was quiet as they sat in the plush leather booth of Le Jardin, a bistro that sat squarely in the neutral zone between the hospital district and the corporate sector. He was pale, the ghost of the fever still clinging to him, but he was eating the truffle mac and cheese with a focused intensity that broke Vanessa's heart. Lucas sat beside him, eyes darting around the room, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the waiters in white jackets with a mix of awe and suspicion, as if waiting for someone to tell them they didn't belong. "It's okay," Vanessa said softly, pushing the bread basket closer to them. "You can have as much as you want. I promise. No one is going to take it away." Lucas looked at her, then grabbed a roll. "We've never been to a place with cloth napkins," he whispered. "Get used to it," Vanessa said, and the fierce protectiveness that had been building in her chest since the emergency room solidified into steel. She had the DNA sample processing at the lab. She had the surrogacy contract in her bag. She held the keys to the kingdom, even if the boys didn't know it yet. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that heralded a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. Vanessa didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. The sudden drop in volume, the subtle straightening of the waitstaff's spines, it was the specific gravitational pull of a man who owned the building. Christopher Sterling walked in like he was campaigning for godhood. He was laughing at something his assistant said, flanked by Cynthia, who looked impeccably bored in a cream silk jumpsuit that probably cost more than the twins' entire lifetime of expenses. She was pushing a sleek, terrifyingly modern stroller, playing the role of the doting mother for the lunchtime crowd. Vanessa stiffened, her hand instinctively moving to cover James's hand on the table. "Just keep eating," she murmured. "Don't look up." But it was too late. Christopher's radar for wealth and status was sharp, but his radar for opportunities to gloat was sharper. His eyes swept the room and locked onto Vanessa. His stride hitched, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he changed course, steering his entourage toward her booth. "Well, well," Christopher's voice boomed, drowning out the soft jazz playing overhead. "If it isn't the Iron Lady taking a break from the grind." Vanessa slowly set down her fork. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She simply turned her gaze on him, cold and unyielding. "Christopher, I'm having lunch. Do you mind?" "Not at all," Christopher said, resting a hand on the edge of our table, invading our space. He looked at the boys, two scrawny teenagers in hoodies that looked starkly out of place against the bistro's decor. He let out a short, derisive laugh. "And who are these charity cases? Did Archer & Co. launch a Big Sister program, or were you just lonely?" Cynthia stepped up beside him, adjusting her sunglasses. "Chris, let's just go," she said, her voice tight. She looked tired, her eyes darting nervously to the stroller where her son, Julian, was sleeping. "No, wait, this is charming," Christopher sneered, leaning closer to Vanessa. "I heard you were burying yourself in work, Van, but I didn't realize you were renting a family to fill the void. What is this, a rental service? Rent a kid for the Barren executive?" Lucas dropped his bread roll. James stopped chewing, his eyes wide with humiliation. Vanessa stood up then. She moved smoothly, placing her body between Christopher and the boys, blocking his view of them. "You need to walk away, Christopher, right now." "Or what?" Christopher challenged, enjoying the audience. "You'll sue me?" "You're pathetic, Vanessa, playing house with strays because you couldn't give me the real thing. Look at what you're missing." He gestured grandly to the stroller. "A real heir, my blood, my legacy." Cynthia didn't look at the stroller. She was looking past Vanessa's shoulder. She was looking at James. James had shifted, peering around Vanessa to look at the man who was attacking her. The light from the window hit his face perfectly, illuminating the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw, the specific arch of his brow, and those piercing, ice-blue eyes. Cynthia froze. Her hand went to her throat. She looked from James to Christopher, and then back to James. The resemblance wasn't just a similarity, it was a mirror image. It was like looking at a time-lapse photo of Christopher Sterling at 13. Then slowly, terrified, Cynthia looked down at the stroller. She looked at her son, Julian, with his soft chin, his brown eyes, his rounder face, the face that looked nothing like Christopher, the face that she had prayed every day Christopher wouldn't question. "Chris," Cynthia whispered, her voice trembling. "Chris, stop." "I'm just teaching her a lesson about reality, Sin," Christopher laughed, oblivious to the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He looked back at Vanessa. "Enjoy your play date, Vanessa. Try not to get too attached. The rental period eventually expires." "You're right," Vanessa said, her voice deadly quiet. "Expiration dates are coming up fast, but not for me." She held Christopher's gaze, her eyes burning with a secret that would destroy him. For a second, Christopher faltered. He saw something in her expression,
Not the shame he expected, but a terrifying predatory confidence. He blinked, unsettled. "Come on," Christopher muttered, abruptly turning away. "This place smells cheap anyway." He marched toward the exit. Cynthia lingered for a fraction of a second. She stared at Lucas, who was now glaring at Christopher's retreating back with the exact same furious, clenched jaw expression Christopher made when he lost a deal. The color drained from Cynthia's face. She looked at Vanessa, and for a moment the two women shared a silent, devastating communication. "I know," Vanessa's eyes seemed to say, "and now you do too." Cynthia turned and practically ran after her husband, the wheels of the stroller squeaking on the polished floor. Vanessa watched them leave. She waited until the door swung shut, sealing the toxicity out. Then she exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and turned back to the booth. "Who was that jerk?" Lucas asked, his voice shaking with anger. "That," Vanessa said, sliding back into the booth and picking up her fork, "was a mistake. A very expensive mistake that we are about to correct." She looked at James, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and awe. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. James nodded slowly. He looked like us in the eyes," he whispered. Vanessa didn't lie. She didn't brush it off. She nodded, solidifying the pact between them. "Yes, he does. And tomorrow I'm going to explain exactly why." She signaled the waiter for the check. The confrontation hadn't broken her. It had only confirmed what she already knew. Christopher was arrogant, Cynthia was terrified, and the boys were the rightful heirs to a kingdom built on sand. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here.
The truth arrived in two separate envelopes, delivered to two separate glass towers in the same city at almost the exact same moment. For Vanessa, the revelation came with a soft digital chime that sounded absurdly cheerful given the seismic shift it heralded. She was sitting at her desk at Archer & Co., the city of New York spread out beneath her like a game board she had finally learned to master. The morning sun was cutting through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but Vanessa saw none of it. Her entire world had narrowed down to the blinking icon on her laptop screen. Subject: Genetic analysis results, rush order number 4492. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. For 7 years, she had carried the label Barren like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. It had defined her marriage, her divorce, and the quiet, empty spaces of her evenings. To click that link was to risk hoping, and hope was a dangerous thing. She took a breath that rattled in her chest and clicked. The PDF opened. It was a dense thicket of numbers, allele markers, and loci charts, but Vanessa's eyes flew to the summary at the bottom of the page. She read it once, then twice. Then she reached out and touched the screen as if to physically anchor the words in reality. Sample A, Child 1, James. 99.9998% probability of paternity. Christopher Sterling. Sample A, Child 1, James, 99.9997% probability of maternity, Vanessa Cross. Sample B, Child 2, Lucas, 99.9998% probability of paternity, Christopher Sterling. Sample B, Child 2, Lucas, 99.9997% probability of maternity, Vanessa Cross. Vanessa let out a sob that was half sob, half laugh. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a delusion. The embryos they had created years ago, the ones Christopher had deemed low viability, the ones he paid a stranger to carry and then paid to erase, had fought. They had survived. "They're mine," she whispered to the empty office. The tears came then, hot and fast, washing away the years of accumulated shame. She wasn't useless. She wasn't broken. Her body had created the blueprint for two brilliant, resilient boys who had found their way back to her against all odds. Maya Lin hadn't just taken the money. She had taken mercy. She had saved them. Vanessa pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking. She looked at the photo of the twins from the science fair that she had printed out and taped to her monitor. They were hers. The pull she had felt in the hospital wasn't phantom. It was the most real thing in her life. 30 blocks of town and the penthouse suite that touched the clouds, the silence was suffocating. Christopher Sterling sat in his private study, the door locked. The air conditioner hummed, recycling the cold, expensive air. Across the desk from him sat Dr. Gallant, a concierge physician who specialized in discretion for the ultra-wealthy. Christopher hadn't slept since the bistro. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that boy, the one in the cheap hoodie, staring at him with his own eyes. The resemblance was haunting, a ghost story he couldn't shake. And then he would look at Julian, his heir, sitting in the high chair, smashing avocados with a soft, round fist. He looked at Julian's brown eyes, his sloping chin, the way his ears lay flat against his head. Paranoia had grown in Christopher's gut like a tumor. He had snatched a pacifier from Julian's mouth this morning while Cynthia was in the shower and summoned Gallant immediately. "Well?" Christopher demanded, his voice tight. "Is he mine? Stop stalling, Gallant." The doctor looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his leather chair, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Sterling, these rapid tests are highly accurate. We compared the child's saliva against your file on record." "And?" Christopher asked. Dr. Gallant slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany desk. He didn't make eye contact. Christopher snatched the paper. His eyes scanned the document, looking for the confirmation, the validation, the scientific proof of his virility that he had built his entire public persona around. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. Conclusion, excluded. The world stopped. The hum of the air conditioner, the traffic below, the beating of his own heart, it all ceased. "Excluded," Christopher whispered. The word tasted like ash. "It means there is no biological relationship between you and the child," Gallant said softly. "I'm sorry, Christopher." Christopher stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. 0%, 0, nothing. The nursery painted royal blue, the magazine covers, the interviews where he bragged about his strong swimmers and his legacy. It was all a lie. A roar built up in his chest, primal and terrifying. He stood up and swept the expensive lamp, the crystal paperweight, and the framed photo of him and Cynthia off the desk. They crashed against the wall, shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Get out," Christopher snarled. "Christopher, Get out," Christopher screamed, his face turning a violent shade of red. The doctor fled. Christopher stood in the wreckage of his study, breathing hard, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard the wood groaned. Cynthia. The door to the study rattled, then opened. Cynthia stood there, holding Julian on her hip. She looked at the shattered glass, then at Christopher's face, and she went pale. "Chris, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Christopher looked at her. He looked at the woman he had destroyed his marriage for, the woman he had chosen because she was fertile, because she was useful. He looked at the child in her arms, the child he had paraded around town like a trophy. He held up the paper. Cynthia froze. Her eyes went wide, darting from the paper to Christopher's murderous expression. She didn't ask what it was, she knew. She clutched the baby tighter, stepping back. "Who is he?" Christopher asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Chris, please, I can explain," Cynthia stammered, tears instantly spilling over. I was afraid you would leave me. You were so obsessed with the baby. I needed to give you one." "Who is he?" Christopher roared, stepping over the broken glass. "It doesn't matter," Cynthia cried, backing into the hallway. "He loves you. You're his father in every way that counts. I am his father in no way that doesn't count. I wanted a legacy. You gave me a bastard." "And what about you?" Cynthia screamed back, cornered and desperate. "You think I didn't see those boys at the restaurant? You think I'm blind? You have sons, Christopher, real ones, and you threw them away for this." The words hit him harder than the paternity test. You threw them away. Christopher staggered back, the strength leaving his legs. He slumped against the doorframe. He had mocked Vanessa. He had called her useless. He had left her in the rain because she couldn't give him a child. But she had. She had given him two brilliant, sharp-eyed boys who were currently living in poverty while he raised another man's son in a palace. The irony was so sharp it felt like it was severing his aorta. He looked at the paternity test in his hand, the 0%, and he thought of the boys in the bistro,
the boys with his eyes, the boys Vanessa was protecting. He had lost everything. He just didn't know it until this exact moment. Across the city, Vanessa wiped her face, stood up, and smoothed her skirt. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for St. Jude's group home. Her voice didn't shake. "This is Vanessa Cross. I'm coming to pick up my sons."
The mahogany doors of the Sterling Enterprises boardroom were heavy, designed to keep noise out and secrets in. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioning was set to a crisp 68 degrees, but Christopher Sterling was sweating. The emergency board meeting had been called weeks ago to finalize the Sterling Dynasty Trust, a legal vehicle that would irrevocably transfer the majority voting shares to his son, Julian, upon his 18th birthday. The papers sat in front of him, a neat stock of vellum waiting for a signature that would secure his legacy forever. But the pen in Christopher's hand hovered, trembling. The board members, 12 of the most powerful people in finance, were watching him with growing impatience. They didn't know about the shattered glass in his study. They didn't know about the 0% paternity test burning a hole in his suit pocket. They only saw a CEO who looked like he hadn't slept in days, staring at a contract that would give his empire to a child who didn't share a drop of his blood. "Christopher," the chairman prompted gently, "we need the signature to file before the quarter closes." Christopher opened his mouth, but no sound came out. How could he tell them? How could he admit that the virility he had bragged about was a lie, that his mistress had plead him for a fool, that he had discarded his wife for a fraud? Then, the heavy doors didn't just open, they were thrown wide. The sound echoed like a gunshot, causing every head in the room to snap toward the entrance. Security should have stopped anyone from reaching the 42nd floor, but the security guards were currently standing aside, looking bewildered and thoroughly cowed by the woman marching past them. Vanessa walked into the room. She wasn't wearing the beige of a victim or the gray of a middle manager. She was wearing white, a sharp tailored suit that looked like a blade of light in the dim room. And she wasn't alone. Flanking her were James and Lucas. Vanessa had taken them shopping. Gone were the ill-fitting hoodies and scuffed sneakers. They wore matching navy suits, crisp white shirts, and ties that matched the color of their eyes. Christopher's eyes. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It wasn't just the interruption, it was the visual shockwave. The board members looked from Christopher at the head of the table to the two boys standing at the foot. The resemblance was so precise, so undeniable, it was as if Vanessa had brought in time-traveling ghosts of Christopher's past. Vanessa walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking a steady, martial rhythm on the parquet floor. She stopped directly across from Christopher, separated by 20 feet of polished wood and 7 years of silence. She tossed a manila envelope onto the table. It slid across the surface, coming to a rest just inches from his trembling hand. "You called me useless," Vanessa said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, clear and cold as a bell. "You told this board and a judge that I was a barren investment, that I couldn't give you a legacy." Christopher stood up slowly, his legs feeling like water. He looked at James, he looked at Lucas. He saw the set of their jaws, the way they stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, a posture he hadn't taught them, but one they had inherited nonetheless. "Vanessa," he whispered, the name sounding like a prayer. "Read it," she commanded. Christopher didn't need to read it, he knew what was inside, but the chairman reached out, took the envelope, and pulled out the summary sheet Vanessa had prepared. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. 2 male heirs. Biological. He looked up at Christopher. "Christopher, what is this? Who are they?" "They are his sons," Vanessa answered, her hand resting protectively on James's shoulder. "The ones he paid a surrogate to get rid of because he thought they were a sunk cost. The ones he erased so he could play house with a liar." A gasp went around the table. The sunk cost letter was attached, proving Christopher's cruelty in black and white. Christopher ignored the board.
He stumbled around the table, moving toward the boys. You kept them?" he stammered, his eyes wet. "Vanessa, I didn't know, I swear. I thought the pregnancy was terminated. I thought—" "You thought what was convenient," Vanessa cut him off. Christopher dropped to his knees in front of the twins. He reached out a hand to touch Lucas, but Lucas stepped back, his face hard. "Don't," Lucas said. It was the first time he had spoken, and his voice was a teenage baritone that sounded exactly like Christopher's. "I'm your father," Christopher pleaded, tears spilling over. "Look at me. Look at this." He gestured wildly around the room. "All of this, it's yours. The company, the money, the buildings. It was always meant for you. I built it for you." He looked up at Vanessa, desperation clawing at his throat. He saw a lifeline. If the boys were his, then the legacy was safe. He could fix this. He could divorce Cynthia, erase Julian, and install his true sons. "Vanessa," he said, scrambling to his feet, a manic hope in his eyes. "We can fix this. We can be a family. I'll give them everything. Top schools, trust funds, the world. And you, I'll give you whatever you want. Come back. Let's raise them together. Let's put the Sterling name back where it belongs." He reached for her hand, thinking that money, as always, was the solvent for all sins. Vanessa didn't step back. She simply looked at his outstretched hand as if it were a dead thing. "You still don't get it," she said, her voice filled with a pity that hurt worse than hatred. "You think you have something we want." "I have everything," Christopher cried. "I have the empire." "You have money," Vanessa corrected. "You have a cold house, a fake marriage, and a board of directors that is currently drafting your resignation." She gestured to the board members, who were currently whispering furiously, phones out, calling legal counsel. Christopher's stock was plummeting in real time. "These boys don't need your money," Vanessa continued. "They are brilliant, they are kind, and they are survivors. They did that without you. They survived in spite of you." "But they are mine," Christopher roared, the entitlement flaring one last time. "My blood." "Your blood, yes, but my sons." She turned to James and Lucas. "Are you ready to go?" James looked at his biological father, a man on his knees, surrounded by wealth but drowning in shame. Then he looked at Vanessa, the woman who found them, fought for them, and claimed them when they were nothing. "Yeah, Mom," James said. "Mom." The word hit Christopher like a physical blow. He watched as Vanessa turned her back on him. He watched as his sons turned their backs on him. "Vanessa, wait!" Christopher screamed, stumbling after them. "You can't leave me. I have nothing else. I have no one else." Vanessa paused at the heavy mahogany doors. She looked back over her shoulder, her silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. "You have your legacy, Christopher," she said softly. "You're the man who threw away a miracle because he was too busy counting coins. That's what you'll be remembered for." She walked out. The doors swung shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing Christopher Sterling inside his tower. He stood in the center of the room, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where his family had been. He looked down at the unsigned trust papers for a boy he wasn't his and the DNA results for the sons who hated him. He sank into his chair, surrounded by the finest mahogany and the coldest air in New York City, and for the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of the word Barren.